So what I want to do is briefly introduce our panelists because I don't want to spend too much time introducing them so that you don't have full opportunities to share what you have to share with us. Dr. Andrea Barthwell is the MD and Chief Medical Officer for Treatment Management Company. Dr. Barthwell's current work is focused on developing strategies to expand access to treatment for opioid dependence disorders, expanding practitioners' knowledge of urine drug testing, and the identification and treatment of substance use and disorders, and helping individuals and families prevent substance use disorders. Dr. Barthwell will introduce us to what opioids is about, basically the introduction to the whole drug and what it does and what it means and how it works in the body. That will be her function on our panel.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here today, and I'm excited to have you, Deborah, as our moderator. With the focus on families, we know that addiction is a family disease, and it makes as much sense to take someone out of that family, send them away to treatment, and return them to that family without doing the critical work with the family, as it would to take someone out, treat leprosy, and return them to a leper colony. While the people in the household don't have the same disease of addiction, they have been affected by that person's disorder. So we are in the throes of this unyielding fury of the opioid pandemic. People call it an epidemic, but we've had continuous opioid use in this country that was reflected in passing the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914, which recognized that if we didn't control access to opioids, the white womanhood would be threatened by exposure to individuals who used opium and opium dens, primarily people of Asian descent. And when we created the Harrison Narcotics Act, which prevented physicians from treating individuals who had addiction at a time when you could send your child to the local pharmacy to sign for laudanum to bring it home to Aunt Mabel so she could take her opium in a liquid form, we uncovered a number of individuals who are opioid dependent. And in fact, at the time, we developed opium treatment programs and began to study the disorder. And we've learned a lot over the years. And what we have accumulated in terms of our knowledge of treating people who not only use opioids, but go on to develop opioid use dependence, is that only about 17% of people who initiate are able to sustain recovery unassisted after treatment, no matter what the form of treatment is. So we're going to talk a little bit about the outcome gap in a minute. But we now have a number of medications which can be used in the treatment of opioid dependence, which is changing how a person lives with the disorder. Just as we are now treating breast cancer as if it's a chronic disease, and diabetes is a chronic disease, when we develop medications, we can at least impact the progression and the loss of life from this disorder. So even though we're in this sort of unmitigated fury of an explosion of this opioid use, there's been a real tepid response on the part of our government, on the part of local communities to it. And while the death toll is rising, we are not seeing effective strategies to shift the epidemic, both to prevent the initiation, intervene early, and treat the disorder to completion. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. But there are some basic ideas that underlie the concepts that I'm going to present to you. One, that drug use is a preventable behavior. And we often get confused between the fact that we can prevent the behavior, but addiction is a fundamental yet treatable disease of the brain. And we often think about the person who has the disorder in terms of the person who chose to use. While use is preventable, and we should do everything that we can to avoid initiation, when the switch is flipped in an individual's brain and they develop the disorder, they no longer have voluntary control over the decision to use or not. So drug use is a preventable behavior, but addiction is a fundamental yet treatable disease of the brain. And one of the things that we don't actually work hard enough to do is to discern, when we have a person in front of us, as to whether they are a user who is voluntarily using, that you can put some external controls on to shift their behavior, versus someone who has this fundamental yet treatable disease of the brain that sends messages from the pleasure and reward center, the very primitive centers of our brain, to the frontal cortex that tells them if they don't respond to the drive to use, that they may as well die. The drive to use is recorded and reacted to in the same system that would drive you to drink seawater if you were in a dinghy after your boat capsized, knowing that if you drink seawater, you will die. And the drive to engage in intercourse, to procreate, to continue to populate the earth, the drive to eat when hungry. These drives are basic survival drives. Even the drive that allows us to respond to guilt by affiliation. Sometimes our guilt about not doing or meeting other people's expectations will drive us to do things that maybe don't enhance our own standing, but lead to cohesion of the group and survival of the species. So this drive to use comes from a very primitive piece of the brain. And in not responding to it, it is perceived by the brain as life-threatening. So you can't do pump therapy. You can't insist that a person stop using when they know that fundamentally if they don't use, they'll die. You can't talk and reason someone out of using. Have you ever tried to tell your mother to stop smoking? And where did it get you, no matter how long you preached? Anybody who continued smoking after the Surgeon General released his report, that smoking causes cancer, had all the education that they needed to do it. So education alone is not enough to shift one's behavior in response to this disease. But other than the fact that it's a preventable behavior and it's a treatable disease, recovery is possible for everyone. And even though I quoted a statistic around 17% stay off drugs for a year after treatment, and that seems fairly desperate, we actually are having improvements in the treatment of the disease. So I want to remind us that to respond to anything, we have to have a balanced approach. We need to prevent initiation, and we need to look at what's going on that undermines rather than undergirds our prevention efforts, right? So as we march toward legalized marijuana across the country, and we send young people a message that marijuana is medicine, we're encouraging initiation on yet another drug. And you only have to look back in time to know that when a cultural expectation, culture, tradition, and ritual is challenged by the introduction of a new substance or a new form of the substance or a new way of using the substance, that the values around how that's managed by the culture is upset, and we create a tipping point in our lives. So when rum was introduced into Western Africa as a commodity in the triangle of slave trade, people who had managed to use palm wine, ritualistic, in their villages, who had very, very low rates of alcohol use disorder, began to die of cirrhosis and liver disease. Andean Indians who live in high altitudes and chew coca leaf to eke a meager living out of the high altitude air, who managed to chew coca leaf for generations and not develop cocaine use disorder, when they began to process the coca leaves for North American consumption and introduced coca paste into their urban centers, they had a cocaine crack epidemic similar to ours in urban centers. Westward expansion brought a change in the lives of Native Americans, and they began to experience a relationship with tobacco that was different than the one that they had experienced prior to Western expansion. And when alcohol distillation was introduced in Europe, Hogarth's art shows what happens when we increase the alcohol content from 6% in wine and 10% in beer to as much as 70% alcohol in distilled beverages. And whole cultures and societies were disrupted. Likewise, when the hypodermic needle was introduced across the world, opioid addiction changed in the early 1900s. So we have to prevent initiation. We have to be careful and mindful of what culture, tradition, and ritual does to manage disorders. We have to identify and intervene early while people still have volitional control, and then we need to improve treatment. Recovery is possible, and what we see when an individual recovers is a change in the way in which they express their values. see more authenticity, emotional competence, healthy relationships. Relationships prior to an intervention on an addiction, the person who is addicted only has relationships with people who either tolerate or support their drug using. So Big Mama hates to see her grandson suffer. So whenever he calls and is in withdrawal, she gives him $20 and he can alleviate his withdrawal. But his brothers and sisters avoid him like the plague. The only people in the lives of the addicted person are people who will either tolerate or support their drug using. And so they have to reestablish relationships. They have to deal with a runaway ego, develop a spiritual way of relating to others, and also long-term application of external strategies that provide, in a structured and supportive environment, the time to create a neuroadaptation away from the way the brain reacted to the chemicals. And in fact, in order to have recovery, in order to get well, people have to stop using and change everything. Stop using and change everything. What we know from treatment outcome is some treatment is better than none, more is better than less, but treatment is best when it's driven by assessment, buttressed with case management, and completed with follow-up care in the community. And treatment doesn't have to be voluntary to be effective. There's counseling treatment and cortical treatment. What I want you to understand about the treatment of opioid dependence is that we have three strategies we can use. We can fix the receptors, we can fill the receptor, or we can block the receptor. And you may notice that in your community there's a preference for one strategy or modality over another. Fixing the receptor requires going away to long-term supportive residential care, and medications are not used. There's a high rate of relapse or leaving treatment if a person doesn't have comfort meds in the early stages of treatment in order to enable them to stay. The filling it is substituting one molecule for the molecule that the person chooses, and so the receptor is left in an on-on position. Many communities reject the notion of filling those receptors because it feels like you're just patching the disease, and in fact you are maintaining the underlying disorder. So methadone and buprenorphine fall into that category. Finally, we find a very strong preference for blocking the receptor. And if you listen to the way in which we describe blocking the receptor, it's a competitive blockade on the receptor by a molecule that doesn't give the individual the feeling that they get when they're using. It's used to impede, to obstruct, or to stymie that person's desire to use, so it's arresting use. So when communities, no two people are alike, no three people are alike, an individual has to have the capacity to choose from this full array of strategies to deal with their opioid dependence. And if a community says all we're going to offer is something that blocks that receptor so they can't use, it almost feels punitive, and it won't be effective for all. So we have to be very careful in understanding it and embracing the notion that not every cancer responds to the same meds in the same way. Some people need surgery and radiation and drugs, and not every addiction is the same. So treatment supports abstinence. It retrains the brain and retools the emotions so that the person can identify, own, and express their feelings. And that's the most important thing that we can do in recreating relationships that have been affected by drug use. And finally, I put up there, and I'll leave up there, the description of what mature recovery looks like after effective treatment. This was done from looking at individuals who had 10 years of sobriety and looking at what they did. They were not using, they were not seeking drugs for quasi-medical reasons. They were avoiding dangers that were associated with cues and craving, which would lead to relapse. Their social connections were improved. They had a level of intimacy in their relationships that they'd not been able to achieve prior to that. We heard that the hopelessness is the basis for this. You know, the only reason in which we live is to connect on a human level with another person. So if you have a chemical interference in your ability to connect on a feeling level with another person, you don't have the amount of intimacy and social connectedness that nourishes you in the community. Recreation and relaxation is expanded. If you can't name 3 things that you do for recreation and relaxation, you need to call me for some therapy. employment and career gets addressed. There is a philosophy of life that guides decisions in recovery that are supportive of growth and higher attainment. Their key activities are focused on their recovery and helping others, and they have an acceptance of their past. They can talk about the fact that they have been addicted and not be traumatized by the story. So with that, I'm going to close and pass it to the next speaker, but I'm going to leave that up there to remind you that this is possible. Treatment works and recovery is possible. Thank you.